Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And can I start by paying tribute to the tremendous leadership that has been provided to RSIS by Ambassador Deska. He's added a clear and articulate Singaporean voice to vital issues of international affairs. And I must say, as he mentioned, somebody who was involved in the origins of this institute in the late 1990s, how delighted and proud I am that it's done so well and is such an impressive and productive institution. It also struck me while preparing remarks on why governments find strategy so difficult that actually Singapore's one of the worst countries to try to make that argument, because it's one of the few countries that has always seemed to me to have a clear sense of strategy and not only that, an ability to see it implemented. And it would be an interesting thing to do, but rather presumptuous, to try to explain why Singapore in many ways has been a strategic success, while other countries with similar attributes have not been so successful. I suspect one would find oneself looking at the clarity of the challenge originally faced by Singapore, the unity and focus of the governing class in meeting that, but also it reminds us that even the cleverest strategy needs to be implemented. And it's in the quality of the implementation and the competence of that that I think Singapore has distinguished itself. Anyway, it's not part of my argument today that strategies invariably fail. My concern is with the expectations that surround strategy as being essential to any problem solving. So my aim is to explore the possibilities and limits of strategy, noting its origins in the military sphere, but its application in many other spheres, including national policy and business practice. But the origins of strategy lie in war. The word comes from the Greek strategos, the art of the general. Its basic themes were developed across the centuries under the heading of the art of war. Our word strategy entered the lexicon in the 18th century from France, referring to something more than tactics and less sneaky than a cunning stratagem. It gained currency during the Napoleonic period as a suggestion that war could be guided by something more systematic than intuition and more reliable than military genius. Tell me, the elderly and skeptical Prince Bolkonovsky asks his son Andrei in Tolstoy's War and Peace, how the Germans have trained you to defeat Napoleon by this new science you call strategy. It did not take too long before the idea of strategy gravitated from the military to the civilian sphere, from battles between armies to those between political parties, to large corporations, to sporting teams, from the war room to the boardroom. So now, everybody has a strategy. No serious organization could imagine being without one. And decisions that have a strategic quality are considered to be far better than those that are merely tactical or random. Having a strategy suggests an ability to look up from the short term and the trivial to view the long term and the essential, to address causes rather than symptoms, to see woods rather than trees. So facing up to any problem or striving for any objective without a strategy seems negligent. If a decision can be described as being of strategic significance, then it's obviously more important than those of a more routine nature. By extension, people making such decisions are far more important than those who only offer advice or are tasked with implementation. I should note my previous job at King's was Vice Principal for Strategy. Given this promise, it's not surprising that there is a constant demand for more and better strategy. Indeed, it's a common complaint that it has come to be neglected by our leaders. In my country, also in the United States, there's a regular theme, a regular lament that somehow we've lost the knack of strategy. You may have seen the mockery that President Obama received when he observed, with regard to meeting the challenge of ISIS, that we do not have a strategy, though we did add the word yet. Now he thinks he's got one. So, to accuse a government or any organisation of a lack of strategy is to accuse it of being myopic and short-term. If only strategy was understood, the country could be inspired by a vision and resources could be geared to well-crafted and realistic goals. Without strategy, it would appear policy is doomed to be incoherent and inchoate. Insert this magic ingredient and everything will fall into place. Sometimes it appears as if it's almost any strategy will do, because at least then there will be clarity. But of course, the demands often assumes a strong view. When a strategy is demanded, there's often a strong view of what a proper strategy would actually look like. This despair about the lack of strategy is often accompanied by accusations of being too risk-averse or spending too much time worrying about opinion polls. Now, none of this concern is new. We might wonder when exactly there was a golden age of strategy when these matters were all well understood by governments. The centenary of the outbreak of the First World War has been marked by a slew of books that remind us of some truly awful decision-making in every capital of Europe in the run-up to the First World War, while the run-up to the Second World War is still held up as an example, at least as far as Britain is concerned, of strategic ineptitude on a grand scale. The weight of expectation around strategy was there from the start. The original surges in enthusiasm in the military, political and business spheres all began with confidence that given the right measures, demanding objectives could be achieved on a regular basis. The Napoleonic phenomenon led, I think, probably the two thinkers who are the originators of strategic thought, Jomini and Clausewitz, led them to explain to expiring generals how they might win decisive battles and so, in the process, determine the fate of nations. The professional revolutionaries of the mid-19th century recalled the French Revolution to imagine equally decisive insurrections in the future from which new forms of social order might emerge. Over a century later, the growth of the apparently unassailable large American corporations led to a new breed of experts in business management to identify organizational structures and concoct long-term plans to sustain this happy state of affairs. But in all these cases, the initial confidence could not and did not last. Victory in battle did not necessarily mean victory in war. Ruling classes accepted reforms and deflected the masses away from revolution. The comfortable position of the American corporations was undermined by successive waves of competition. Nonetheless, despite this history, much strategic writing continues as if the decisiveness and control and predictability sought in the past might yet be found if only the right formulations could be discerned. This is what strategy tries to do. It tries to control our future by ensuring that current actions have the most desirable consequences. When a strategy is demanded, often the first requirement is a compelling vision of the future. What are your objectives? What are you trying to achieve? And then a plan to realize this vision. A sequence of steps that will enable one with confidence to move from one state of affairs to another. And this is essentially why, when governments develop such plans and claim them as their strategy, they find it difficult and the results are often disappointing. Now, of course, all organizations need plans of some sort. But these work best in areas where there can be confidence that human inputs can be controlled and delivered. Unfortunately, success may depend on individuals and groups who, while supposedly on the same side, have distinctive perspectives and interests. Anybody who has been involved in senior management knows that as information forces its way up and orders cascade down, distortions in meaning soon appear. And then, when strategy involves looking outside the organization to competitors, rivals, enemies, as well as allies and partners, the problems grow. Your plan has to accommodate others with their own plans and perspectives. Other willful beings are involved. And once that happens, the possibility exists for any carefully prepared move to be frustrated. The great Field Marshal von Moltke, who described strategy as a system of expediencies, famously understood this when he remarked that no plan survives contact with the enemy. I prefer Mike Tyson's pithy version of the same point: everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. When all the moving parts, their properties and interactions are known, and none of them can be said to have an independent will, we can have a plan. The problem then in design and implementation is essentially one of engineering, of sequencing and alignment. Strategy comes in, however, when there is uncertainty, when the moving parts are not fully understood and do have independent wills of their own. Just to give you an example of the difference between an engineering problem and a strategic problem, some of you may recall President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative of 1983, which came to be known as Star Wars. The idea was to build an elaborate defensive system to protect the United States from nuclear-tipped missiles launched by the Soviet Union. Better, said the President, to protect lives rather than avenge them. And it was hard to argue with that sentiment. But the problem was at the comparative ease of attack over defense. For each extra increment of defense, it was much cheaper to add an increment of offense. The offense could choose when and where to strike. The defense would have to be on constant alert and cover a range of possible targets. It would need to protect targets that the enemy had no intention of attacking and anticipate changes in offensive systems which would be quite different from those actually made. The proponents argued nonetheless that exciting new defensive technologies could be found, and they would cite America's technological triumphs, such as putting a man on the moon, as evidence that the country had the brains and resources to crack any problem. But this is where the difference between an engineering and a strategic problem comes in. The analogy was not apt. The moon was not attempting to repel borders by shifting its position and shooting at approaching astronauts. Getting a man on the moon was largely an engineering problem completed with human courage and skill, but dealing with a missile attack was a strategic problem with no definitive solution if the size and form of the attack could be varied. Thus, a strategic problem, to borrow from Tom Schelling, is about interdependent decision-making. It requires decisions being made that are affected by expectations about how others might make their own decisions, which in turn will be depending on their expectations about your decisions and how you might act. And this soon renders planning impossible. And if you don't accept it, if you try to accommodate all of this in a plan, you end up with a logic that was, for me, most vividly expressed by someone called Harry Yager, a professor at the US Army War College. And he considers strategy to be a very complicated undertaking precisely because it must consider the views of allies, adversaries and other actors and address resources and organizational issues. He wanted it, didn't expect it to be predictive, but he wanted it to be proactive. And the claim was that proper analysis would make it possible to understand what was going on and therefore anticipate and manipulate in some way the strategic environment. And this is what he said was required of the strategist. The strategist required a comprehensive knowledge of what else is happening within the strategic environment and the potential first, second, third, etc. order effects of his own choices on the efforts of those above, below, and on the same level with him, whether they be friendly, adversary, or indifferent actors. Strategists must think holistically, that is, comprehensively. Good strategy is never developed piecemeal or in isolation. If that's the case, we can assume there has never been a good strategy. Nobody is capable of anticipating and comprehending quite as much as required. By just thinking of this ideal standard, what I would call the myth of the heroic strategist, that can comprehend everything and anticipate all, we actually can identify some of the reasons why governments do find strategy difficult. First, a holistic approach is both unrealistic, a counsel of perfection, but also it may seem sensible to think of our environment as a system in which we are all one of many interacting parts. But that's actually beyond human capacity to comprehend all of this at once. And actually, most of the time, only a part of the overall system is relevant. Secondly, however much you know about your environment, however much information is coming in, it's useless unless you can turn it into some reliable theories of cause and effect. Strategy must assume that certain acts cause certain effects. Otherwise, why do one thing rather than another? But once you've got to take into account too many variables, then it's very hard to have a compelling theory of causation. The most powerful theories are often the simplest. But on the other hand, if your simple theory ignores too much reality, then the application of the theory will not produce the desired effects. Just one ignored factor or some chance event will change the outcome. So it's very difficult when you're trying to work out what to do in a complex system to be sure of causation. And even if you've hit on a theory that 90% of the time will give you the right answer, that 10% could be the critical one and the one that you face. And even when intended consequences are achieved, there can also be the unintended consequences that negate the value of those intended. And looking back at the military campaigns of the last decade, one can see a number of cases where the immediate objectives were obtained, but over time, the unintended consequences became far more important than the intended. And all these uncertainties and unreliable theories can paralyze decision makers. It is actually very hard sometimes to know what to do. And sometimes one might argue, therefore, the only way to avoid the paralysis is to have some decisive will, which can lead to brilliant but also terrible decisions. So you will have found recently, while there's been discussion of Ukraine, that President Putin is often seen to be a bold strategist. He's always one step ahead. He puts NATO and the European Union on the back foot. They feel confused, they look confused and uncertain in response. And it's true, Putin has taken one initiative after the other, but they've been a series of pretty terrible decisions nonetheless. It may be a bold strategist, but that doesn't mean to say it's a good one. Strong decisions must still be interpreted and implemented through what tend to be imperfect organizations. Successful strategy is never solely an act of will, but requires coordinated and intelligent action. It has to be implemented. And even a strong leader can never lead on everything. And a strong leader can also fall prey to hubris and sycophantic advice. A wise leader will be strong enough to take criticism and challenge and understand the need to act through imperfect organizations. A mere exercise of will is not enough. To explain a bit more, I just want to take you through something, again, a number of you may be familiar with. I certainly came to be so, which is the production of formal strategy documents. Most organizations need these now and again, certainly universities do. And they're often produced because of a schedule. 4 years have passed, and it's time for a new official strategy. And you start with a pressing problem, some new, potentially destabilizing development which must be addressed. You come up with a solution. And then you face two different sorts of objections. First, some will say you're addressing the wrong problem. not my problem. Your problem, not mine. Secondly, your solutions cause me problems. So the document has to be watered down and compromised to deal with any number of problems that important people in the organisation think to be important and don't want to see ignored. And they must avoid solutions that offend key people in the organisation. Then, you know, the document is going to have to be made public, and there will soon be concerns about alarming staff and alerting rivals and competitors about your future intentions. So it becomes watered down even more. And no wonder strategy documents, when they are published, are often vague, aspirational, and have rather short half-lives. So I'm all in favour of strategic thinking, but what I'm trying to warn against is sort of the reification of strategy as some super-intelligent product around which all activity can and should be organised. Strategy is not about planning to reach predetermined goals, although that can be part of it, but about managing shifting political relationship to achieve the best outcome. Whatever our goals, strategy in the first instance will always be shaped by current circumstances and start with specific problems. And if there is no pressing problem, there will be an absence of strategy. Strategy is governed by the starting point and not the end point. The strategist has to work with the resources available in existing circumstances. Strategies are described as being about achieving long-term objectives, but actually, because of all the many human factors in play, they are bound to be short-term in the first instance. This is emphatically not an argument against imagination and ambition, nor is it an argument for pure pragmatism. A direction of travel is needed as well as a sense of destination. My point is only that best strategic practice tends to start with a problem at hand rather than the distant objective, but may often not get beyond an aspirational statement. It accepts a degree of adaptability and flexibility. Now, what I want to do now is move from talking about the problems to how we may think of strategy in the way I've just been indicating. And I want to just make a few points here and then open it up for discussion. I describe strategy as the art of creating power. And it is about the exercise of power. We approach every encounter with a pot of power, whether material wealth, physical strength, a keen intelligence, or a fine reputation. Good strategy adds to the pot, and bad strategy subtracts from it. In any conflict, whether friendly rivalry, competition for market share, an election, or all-out war, the influence of strategy can be expressed as the difference between what you might have anticipated on the basis of that balance of power and what you actually see at the end. I said before that you can plan in situations under your control, because in such situations you are all powerful. The will of the planner will be honoured by all those charged with implementing the plan. There may be a strategy, but it's relatively easy. But if the gap between your assets and your aspiration is small, then the demands on the strategists will not be that great. Even a determined enemy might be crushed by overwhelming strength. In Ecclesiastes, there's the famous observation that the race is not always won by the swiftest, the battle is not always won by the strongest. But the American humorist Damon Runyon added, that's the way to bet. Normally, the race is won by the swiftest and the fight is won by the strongest. Most of the time, the outcome of a contest can be anticipated by looking to the side with superior power. So it's working against the odds that requires the greatest strategic aptitude. The need for real creativity in strategy comes when the gap between assets and aspirations is disturbingly large. Or countries dissatisfied with the status quo, say Russia, say China, may have a revisionist view about a world that should better accommodate their interests. But status quo powers, like the United States or the United Kingdom, are unlikely to have such a view. By definition, status quo powers are largely happy with what is. They wish to maintain a broadly satisfactory international order with borders respected and trade free. Therefore, for a status quo power, successful strategy involves not much happening. In fact, a day when nothing happens is a good day for strategy. Their grand visions are always likely to look like improved versions of the present day with some of the nasty bits removed. And all of this explains why the strategic problems faced by the weaker parties, the underdogs, the revisionists, are far more interesting than those of the stronger, and why the most inveterate strategists are often the revisionist radicals and revolutionaries. Now, much of the literature on strategy argues for compensating for weaknesses and resources by outsmarting opponents. There's always also an assumption that good strategy will represent a superior intelligence, taking advantage of the boring, ponderous, muscle-bound approaches adopted by those who take their superior power for granted. Strategy goes towards Odysseus rather than Achilles, for the cunning rather than brute strength. Not surprisingly, Sun Tzu is favoured by those with this approach, looking to deception and better intelligence as a way of winning wars. Such an approach, of course, can backfire when you find you're not dealing with an inferior intelligence, but one that's actually as good as yours. And one of the problems, I think, with the approach encouraged by Sun Tzu, not in terms of his original meanings, certainly not in terms of the value of reading him, but in the way it tends to get interpreted, is, I think, it encourages the view of always being able to outsmart your opponents. Some of you, I don't know how many, I presume The Sopranos made it to Singapore. Those of you who watched the program The Sopranos may recall that the psychiatrist who had this mafia boss as a patient was objecting to the idea and said to him at one point, if you just want a better strategy, go and read Sun Tzu. And he came back and said, yeah, I read that Sun Tzu. It's better than Machiavelli. Immediately, the sales of Sun Tzu in New Jersey shot up on Amazon, and as its value for a villain became apparent. Of course, the iconic story of outsmarting your opponent is David and Goliath. I think it's just worth spending a few moments just looking at this story. I mean, you know the story, the basic one of David, the shepherd boy, coming to the aid of the Israelites when they were facing a challenge from the Palestinians, and the champion of the Palestinians was Goliath of Gath, a large and powerful man, and nobody had come forward to take on the challenge. The first point that's worth noting that people forget about this story is there was an obvious challenger who was King Saul, who was the first king of the Israelites. They'd been led by prophets before that. But he was a very cautious man. An actual message of the story is that if you believe in God, if you trust in God, then you'll be fine, because Saul had lost that trust, and David still had it. But what we remember about the story is of David refusing to put on Saul's armor, going towards Goliath with his sling, and when Goliath starts to roar at him, am I a dog that thou comest at me with staves? All of a sudden, David takes out a sling, knocks down Goliath with a blow to his forehead, and when he falls to the ground, he goes and cuts off his head, and the Philistines retreat. Now, as I said, the basic lesson the Bible expects us to learn from this is trust in God. Because this was a very high-risk plan. Then you can soon think of the ways it could have gone wrong. Suppose David had missed, or if the stone had pinged off Goliath's armour, there would have been no second chance. Suppose Goliath, after being felled, had recovered quickly enough to prevent David cutting off his head. Winning in the first round may be of little benefit against an opponent able to get back on his feet. Suppose the Philistines had not accepted defeat. They thought this was a bit tricky, not quite following the rules of the game, and they hadn't accepted this as a victory. Suppose David tried to repeat the trick on a future enemy. The next opponent would know what to expect. He'd have a better helmet to start with. And we never hear again. We hear of David fighting many other battles. We never hear again of him using a sling. Deception may work first time, but rarely the second. And I think there's a better approach. I'm all for trying to outsmart and to use your intelligence. But actually, if you look back, the best approach is to find friends and allies. One of the things, when I was writing my book on the history of strategy, one of the things that fascinated me was the work that was done first in a book called Chimpanzee Politics, which gives you the idea. And what came out of this work was that although one assumes that when one alpha male is challenged by another to be the dominant figure, that this is done on the basis of brute force, on just who is the stronger. And what Frans de Waal, a Dutch scientist, noticed when he observed groups of chimps in Antwerp Zoo was actually it wasn't like that. Rather than just charge at the strongest, they use social maneuvers to gain in authority and to gain supporters and friends. That it was coalition forming that made the difference. Although chimps do fight, that was rarely the reason for a transfer of power. If it did, it was often at the end of a long process. What I found particularly interesting was the idea that the core elements of strategic activity are evident in primates. Critical is the ability to recognize what's called a theory of the mind, to understand that somebody else's behavior, another's behavior, is affected by the way that they see the world, and they see it differently from you. And once you understand that, then it provides opportunities to influence. So empathy is important, as well as the ability to form coalitions. Indeed, it becomes easier to form coalitions if you have that quality of empathy. And just to illustrate what I mean, just take a quick example. Consider Churchill in May 1940. I think this illustrates two important things about strategy. First, the problem faced by Churchill in May 1940 was not how to win, but how not to lose. And people often talk about strategy as being very proactive and offensive-oriented, and we're going to change things. But actually, a lot of the time you need strategy is because somebody else has taken initiative, and somebody else is putting you under pressure. And so the first weeks of Churchill's premiership, when he didn't have great authority within government, was discussion of a possible peace plan to put to Hitler. And it was not taken up, not as Churchill would have us believe in his memoirs, because the thought of negotiation was never considered. It was. But because it didn't seem absolutely necessary at the time. They could hold on, and something else might happen if they did. And so the first question was, can they hold on? And of course, if they'd gone for a negotiation, the question that might well have undermined popular morale and made it harder to hold on. So they didn't go for that. They tried to hold on, then Dunkirk. And Churchill had an idea about what would be, what might make the difference. And what it was the entry of another power into the war against Hitler. And the power he had in mind was the United States. And when, after 18 months, the United States did join the war, because Japan had attacked it, Churchill rejoiced. So we had won after all. How long the war would last or in what fashion it would end, no man could tell, nor did I at this moment care. We should not be wiped out. Our history would not come to an end. What he understood was the importance of alliance. In fact, already before this, when Stalin unwittingly had joined the war because Germany had attacked Russia, and it was pointed out in the House of Commons that Stalin was the opposite of what Churchill, the old anti-Bolsheviks, approved of. Churchill observed in the Commons, if Hitler had invaded Hades, I would have a good word to say for Satan in the House of Commons. He understood the importance of coalitions. So what I'm arguing for is the ability to think strategically, to think about situations and the possibilities within them. But it's a process of constant adaptation, adjusting ends to means as well as means to end, keeping in mind a number of goals, short-term as well as long-term, becoming more or less ambitious as circumstances change, paying attention to shifting power balances, sometimes relying on overwhelming force and at other times guile, calculating future moves with close attention to detail, and then apparently acting on whim and impulse as unexpected dangers or opportunities present themselves. Strategy is not therefore about planning to reach predetermined goals, that can be part of it, but about managing shifting political relationships to achieve the best possible outcome. And in doing this, I would argue that judgment is a critical ingredient, which can't be taught by rote or as part of a formula, may well reflect experience and intuition, what Kahneman now might call System 1 thinking. Of course, if you're then trying to explain what you're doing to others, then you need to articulate it, to develop out your ideas. So judgment alone isn't enough. You've got to be able to explain to others what you're doing. And as I've tried to indicate, if the key thing is a coalition, the most important conversations about strategy are going to be with other members of your coalition. And if you need unity, then you may well end up with something that doesn't appear wholly coherent in relationship to the opponent. But the unity is still the key thing. And that is, I think, why you get the laments about NATO and the European Union in trying to hold on to their union in dealing with the new challenge from Russia. It doesn't necessarily make you look strategic decisive, but the key strategy is to hold your alliances and your unions together. So I don't think we should therefore be contemptuous of governments or politicians when they seem to struggle with strategy. We shouldn't worry if they think about public opinion and future elections. That's what they do. I always recall reading Ted Sorensen's explanation of why the quarantine was a better option than an airstrike during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what he said was he tried to write the speech for both.